the apostles. Does anybody else have a different word for all than all in the very beginning? Fear. What do y'all have? What translation y'all using that has fear? New King James. New King James. King James. Okay, great. That is the more accurate translation. The word is in Greek is phobos. That is fear, and so it's a reverential awe. So, and this is important to notice. Verse 43 is talking about the outsiders looking in. Right. This is not the fear or awe doesn't come upon. We're not talking about it coming upon the ones who have been converted. We're talking about the outsiders who are looking in. Okay. So it's not so much of fear, and that's probably why other translations have moved away from fear. They use things like, in fact, one translation I saw had reverential awe, one had like great appreciation or something like that. It's not that they were afraid of them. In fact, it's the opposite, we'll find out. It's that they were awed by what they saw happening, right? They weren't afraid to the point of wanting to run them out of town. They were reverently taking notice of what was going on. They were seeing the miracles and the acts that the apostles were doing, and they were taking notice of it and thinking. So, and these are other Jews, so they're thinking, "This is interesting. What's going on here?" You know, that's the kind of awe, not like, "Oh, we got to get away from them." That doesn't come till later in the book of Acts. Here, it's still. We'll see that they're still looked on pretty well. Okay, now verse 44 through 47 is kind of a unit. I'm going to read all that together, and then we'll come back and break it apart. So, verse 44. And all who believed were together and had all things in common, and they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. And day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved. So like the way that verse 42 gave us 4 things the church was devoted to, these verses show us how they behaved. All right, so 42 was the 4 things they were devoted to. This is kind of if you're devoted to those things, what are the outworkings of that? How does that look to people around you? Number 1 is radical generosity. This is verses 44 and 45. And all who believed were together and had all things in common. This is that common is that word koina that I talked about earlier. That doesn't mean that that doesn't mean like we both like the color red. That's something we have in common. This is like they held possessions in common, like a commune. Yes, right. Think of common like a commune would be used today. And they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. Okay, so notice that it says, it's talking about that they are selling their possessions and belongings. It uses 2 words there that are very similar in meaning, but it uses them both. Like, what's the difference between possessions and belongings in English? Probably not much. It's kind of the same thing. Now, in the Greek, there's a little bit of a nuance to it. It would be more accurately translated possessions and goods. So think of it like they're selling what they have, things that they own, property. That could be like real estate property. In fact, eventually the word for possessions, like after in classical Greek, which kind of comes, or Greek that comes after the Bible's time, the language changes just like our language changes. That word eventually gets used specifically for real estate. That becomes like the word for property as like land and houses and things. But here it's still being used kind of just for possessions in general. It could be furniture, could be things like that. So possessions is stuff, and then goods would be like things that you can produce and sell. So they're sharing, sometimes they're selling things that they own to provide. Sometimes that just means that they're using their gifts and talents to produce stuff that, just like, we don't kind of live in that kind of world anymore, but even 100 years ago, 150 years ago, you lived on what you produced. And you produced things and you traded for other things, and that's how, if you wanted something, you had to give something for it. We bartered a lot more. Now we just we work a job and we get paid the money and the money pays for things. But this is more of like goods and possessions. Maybe we could translate that now to possessions and money. Maybe our goods nowadays would be our money. So they're selling what they have and what they can produce or make. This is an ongoing thing done based on need, all right? So they didn't just sell everything they had all at once. They sold them as others had needs. So that's important to know. It's not that they became believers and just liquidated all their assets and brought it to the church and just, this is what, let's live on this. Okay, I think that's how I used to read this and think it's going on. You do get that story of Ananias and Sapphira, but remember, they had sold a field, and they brought it and that's what it's talking about. The people were selling things and then bringing those proceeds to the church to be shared amongst. So, and that idea of they're just selling things as they need to changed my mindset, because it's not, again, let's all join a commune. It's not let's all liquidate our assets, let's join all those resources together, and let's just live off of that. This is, as needs arose, they made a way to cover those needs. So somebody else needs something, and you've got this extra whatever that you're not really using or that you can live without, and so you liquidate that to meet that person's need. This is it's a radical form of generosity. So are we supposed to live a communal life where everything is shared and no one has anything that is theirs? No, I would say probably that is not what this is teaching. I mean, there are some people who go that far. I would say that's probably an inaccurate use of the way this works. So then what is being described? I think it's what we're talking about, radical generosity. Many of us are generous, but are we generous to the point of lowering our comfort level? In fact, I probably can ask this. How many of y'all have given something to someone in some way, like in the past year? And that could be giving to the church, that could be providing giving somebody something, money or help or whatever. How many of y'all have done that in some way in the past? Well, no, just anything, or just like that can be your tithe to the church. That can be your giving to some organization or something. Okay, right. I assume that would be 100% participation. It's just even if you're really, even if you don't have a lot of resources, you typically can help somebody out in some way, right? Okay, so then then this other question comes out of that, and this one you don't answer out loud. How many of us give out of a true sacrifice to meet others' needs? Like, I'm going to not have this for myself so that they can have enough for this, right? Yeah, it can be time too. Time, resources. Yeah. I think that, so what because it's hard for us, I think in the American church, at least for me, maybe I'm just speaking from my own heart, maybe you are better than me, but I give out of my abundance. Like when I've got a lot, then I give out of that. But rarely do I say, I'm going to provide this person's need at the expense of this thing that I want. That's rare in my life of, I'm going to not have my streaming channels so that I can do this. I'm going to not have this hobby that I'm really into so that I can do this for somebody else. And that's the kind of generosity that this church was demonstrating. It was giving of yourself to the point of making you uncomfortable so that somebody who was even more uncomfortable would be less miserable. Yeah, right, that's good. Hey, that should have been the title of the Given Up to Give. Yeah, that's good. Okay, so radical generosity was one of the things that they were displaying. Secondly is that they worshiped together. That's kind of a bedrock and foundational that I think most of us would not have any problem disagreeing with. Look at verse 46 And day by day, take a note of that day by day. I'll explain it later. Day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all people. So they're worshiping in the temple just as they had done when they were Jews. So at this point, this is like day one. How are they, right early on, the very beginning of the church? The way that they were worshiping is they just kept doing the things they had been doing before. They used to go to the temple. Now they are believers in Christ. This doesn't mean that they forsook their Jewishness. This was an addition. Now it changed the way they understood salvation, but they weren't running away from one thing to go to another at this point. So they just kept worshiping in the temple like they had done before. They went there, they worshiped, they were breaking bread together. They're not reinventing the wheel. And I think this further shows what Jesus meant when he says, I have not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. Jesus didn't say you now have to stop being Jewish and strictly this. In fact, that's kind of what, later on when people are telling the Christians they have to become Jewish first and then Christians, he's saying, no, you don't have to do that. You also don't have to do the other. You don't have to stop your Jewishness to become Christian. It's a fulfillment of those things. It's just, you believe the whole Old Testament as a Jewish person. Now you just add the way that Jesus fulfilled the Old Testament. Jesus fulfilled the promises of the Old Testament. It's just an extension of those promises, okay? So that they're worshiping together, and I would think we would all agree that is like a foundational bedrock of what we do as a church. Their worship goes deeper than just the temple, though. They're also eating meals together. Again, this mention of sharing meals has nothing to do with the Lord's Supper. So that earlier when we talked about breaking bread, probably had a little more thought of the sacred, sacramental part of the Lord's Supper, something special that's not just a regular meal. Here, I think it's talking more about meals, just the everyday common meals that they were having together. They're simply sharing meals with glad and generous hearts. So a church should be connected by where they worship, but that connection should go deeper than that. So are you connected with other church members outside of just meeting during the service times? If we had to lock the doors, would the church continue? Like if Pine Forest, if authorities came bursting in the door and said, you can't meet in here anymore. This property is closed to you. Would Pinecrest Baptist Church cease to exist? Right. It shouldn't. That's the deeper foundational truth of and that's what, when you talk to people who live in other parts of the world where they are more persecuted, they would say, yeah, big deal. That's just the place we meet. We are the fellowship of the people. That's what makes us who we are. And I think that's one of the churches that during COVID, when we couldn't meet in person anymore, I felt like our church survived a lot better than others that I knew. I would talk to friends who were pastors who were worried they weren't going to be able to make the bills. They were worried about when they started meeting again, they had lost 3/4 of their people, and where did all those people go? And they were really stressed. And it felt, while some people fell off, or the number, if you looked at the attendance, you'd see that there was a drop off. But in all, we still are fairly healthy, and I think that's because we had a deeper community rooting than maybe some other people I know who go to churches at other places, right? Because we have valued that part. Doesn't mean that we can't make it better, but I think that's why we tended to do pretty well, and other churches during COVID were really stressed. We got to get those doors back open. If people aren't here, they're not invested, and it's because I think those churches probably had done a bad job of connecting people communally and just kind of connected them by being here on Sunday. So, worshiping together and sharing meals, all of those as part of a community. And then this little passage here that says, received their food with glad and generous hearts, verse 47, praising God having favor with all the people. Again, those people are not the believers in the church. This is all the people. That's why I say this is different than what happened in keep going, and Stephen gets stoned in a couple chapters, and things turn radically different. But here, they had favor with all the people. Their worship and fellowship spilled over into their neighborhood and community. If the church is really doing its job well, then it will have a positive impact on the community, not a negative. We won't suck and feed from the community. We will feed and nourish the community. If the church is really doing its job well, then it will have that doesn't mean that that you don't face persecution. We're going to see that the church eventually does. But the good that it does will be noticed by those who are around, but not of. People who are, have connections, they see what's going on there, but they're not in the church. They'll notice those kind of things. One of the things that I always, I had a pastor in Dallas who used to bring this up a lot, that if your church closed down tomorrow, would the community miss it? Would they care? Oh. Oop.
That's legit. They called me, and I was like, no.
We were just meeting in another. Yeah.
So I think they will.
Yeah. Yeah. You want the answer to be yes, right? You don't want to be a church that is simply taking up space and not paying taxes, right? Like, we don't want the city of Silsbee, or I don't know, what taxes do you pay out here? Just the county taxes? Hardin County. So you don't want the county to go, man, I wish that church would close down so that at least we could make income off the tax space. You want them to say, well, they're not paying taxes, but the good that they're doing, and that's the reason why churches don't pay taxes, by the way. The good that they are doing within the community more than makes up for the lack of income that the county would get, right? So anyway, that's a good way to always be judging ourselves. Would the community care? Would the neighborhood care if the church disappeared? The answer should be yes. We hope that is yes. We need to be doing things to make sure that is yes. All right, and then lastly, there at the very end, and the Lord added to their number day by day those who are being saved. Remember, I told you to take notice of day by day, verse at the very beginning of 46. This is like bookends to this passage. So they, day by day, were doing these things that the church should be doing, and in return, day by day, God was adding to their numbers. If the church is being the church, then God will do the heart work to those that they are trying to minister to around them. Or I think it's written here intentionally. That doesn't mean it's one for, it's not a rewards thing, but when God sees his people working, he will work with them. And so day by day, you're doing the work, and day by day, he's changing hearts. Okay, so we come to the application. Application for all of us is, are you being the church? Not are you coming to church, not are you giving to the church, not even are you serving the church, though all of those things are good, and you should be doing those things. But you can do all of those things and still not actually be the church. The church is devoted to studying God's word, fellowship, breaking of bread, and prayer. Those devotions work themselves out in our radical generosity, in our worship together, and in how deeply connected we are. So for doing those things, then we'll be a pleasing aroma that finds favor amongst the people who are outside our church, and God will use our dedication to draw men and women unto himself, and that is our highest goal. So we should always be judging ourselves. Are we doing these things? Are we being the church, or are we just coming to church? Are we just giving to the church? Are we just serving the church, or are we actually being the church? And really that comes down to a individual one-on-one. The church is strong because the individuals are doing they're devoted to these things. All right? Any questions or comments? Yep.
There was that transition time of when they started moving off, and because it says, the Lord added to the church.
Mm-hmm.
Add to the temple, he added to
To church, yeah.
So they grew and then branched off into small groups, or however all that evolved.
Yep. The history of the church, if you kind of keep reading through Acts, is that this is how it starts, and this is what they're doing. And they start to get a little bit of persecution. Where does that persecution actually come from? The Jews, the religious people. It doesn't come from the Romans or the pagans. They are actually, or they're listening, or they're part of the ones being converted. The people who don't like what's going on are the deeply religious. This is always something I just kind of mentioned to myself to always make sure I'm not becoming that person. I'm not becoming the Pharisee that Jesus was always. I'm not becoming the person who's so devoted to their religion or traditions that they're not doing what Jesus asked them to do, which is what they had become. But anyway, so they're meeting this way, and then they start to feel a little bit of persecution. Now remember, Jesus had told them in the Great Commission to go out and be disciples in Jerusalem and in Judea and in Samaria and to the ends of the earth. And so right now, they are just being they're just sharing the gospel in Jerusalem. They haven't even left the city, for the most part. They may be traveling right around. Maybe they've made it to Judea, the area around Jerusalem, because actually it's not a very big area. But they're not spreading. And then in chapter 7, Stephen gets stoned, and that is a turning point where the Jews turn on the Christians, and that's when they are forced to spread, but probably because they weren't doing it of their own accord. They were happy to just kind of stay in their groups. But God forces them out, and that's where you see the explosion of the church, where it starts to get a big foothold in Antioch, and then Paul starts to take it around on missionary journeys, and that's how it works. And so it would have been, you think about the kind of the same way we do churches now. You meet in a home because that's all you got. If you give a little bit of money, maybe you rent a retail space. Actually, we know that that's what they would do. They'd meet in a shop, or somebody owned a bigger business or a bigger home. They'd meet there. And then eventually you get enough money that you start to build your own facilities, and those happen a couple hundred years later. But yeah, that's how, originally they just kept worshiping like Jews. They didn't know anything else to do. And they're just telling those people, hey, this Messiah that you've been promised, he's here. It's great news for us, And then until they get kicked out and they realize, they don't want to hear that good news anymore. Any other questions, comments?